Morning and welcome to this weekly webinar. Today we're talking about cash flow, which is quite an important subject if you're running a business. So think about the problems if you have poor cash flow. It could be missed tax bills. I don't know if you've ever experienced that, when you've got the VAT bill to pay but you just don't have the money in the bank to cover it. Sleepless nights worrying about how you're going to make ends meet. Scrambling to cover payroll, to cover supplier bills, to get that wholesaler bill paid. It's a challenge. Cash flow can cause huge headaches if you don't know how to manage it properly. So in this webinar, we're going to talk about, why is cash flow important? What actually is it? And some simple tricks to help with cash flow to avoid having those kind of problems. Because the reality is that cash flow issues can bring down even profitable businesses. If you don't manage that flow of cash through your business, even if you're making a profit, you can get into real trouble. And the idea behind cash flow, simply put, is it's the flow of cash through your business. That's sort of the name. It says what it is. Imagine a conveyor belt where money goes on to the start of the conveyor belt, money comes off at the end. And you've got to have that constant flow of money coming through your business. And then things come off the conveyor belt throughout the lifetime of the job. So, at the end, you want to make sure that there's enough cash coming off to cover all of your expenses and of course to pay yourself and for profit too. And we're going to talk about those three elements throughout this webinar. In the past, with my business, the biggest struggle for cash flow has just been not really monitoring it properly. So, some months it would be, oh, great, the bank account's looking very healthy. And then the next month it would be, oh my goodness, we've got barely enough to pay all of our bills this month. What's going on? And the issue with that is that I was just not monitoring the cash flow. I wasn't tracking it, because you've got so many different factors that fall into place when it comes to cash flow. You've got the money that comes in from your customers, from the jobs that you've done, and then you've got money that goes out. Some of those things are directly related to those jobs, like your materials, but then you've got all of your overheads that are falling off that conveyor belt as well throughout the month or throughout the year. So the thing with cash flow is you've got to know, okay, what is coming in, what is going out, and you've got to make sure ultimately that what is coming in is more than what's going to be going out. Otherwise you've got a problem. That's why the pricing webinar that we did a couple of weeks ago is actually really important, because ultimately you can never fix your cash flow if you're not running a profitable business. No matter how many tricks you use from this webinar to improve your cash flow, if you're earning more than if you're spending more than you're earning, your cash flow is always going to be a problem eventually. So, the first lesson should be know how much you need to charge, make sure you're charging enough to make a profit. That's kind of a given. But then there's issues with cash flow, even if you are making a profit, like we said, because what can happen, and what I see a lot of businesses doing, is they don't take any money up front from customers. So then what happens is they do the job, they've paid for the materials, then they're waiting for the customer to pay. And I can see you all laughing here. So you've maybe experienced this yourself before and learned the hard way. I know I certainly have. Imagine you've done, several days work for this customer. You've spent maybe £1,000 or more on materials for this job. And you're sitting there in your home office going, oh my goodness, this customer owes me 3,000, 4,000, whatever it is. I'm massively out of pocket if this customer doesn't pay. And that's a huge risk that so many tradespeople put upon themselves on a regular basis because they don't charge a deposit, which is just absolutely mad in my opinion. So the first tip that I would say for any business owner to help with cash flow is take a deposit up front to cover at least your materials. That way, when it comes to paying your materials, at least that money's there when the bill comes in. And there's other things, other tricks and things that you can do to help with, cash flow when it comes to paying materials, which we'll talk about a bit later as well. But ultimately, like, the deposit thing is so important. So for us, we take a 50% deposit for most jobs. And if you weigh up most of the jobs that you do, you'll probably find that they're about 50% labor and materials. Maybe some are 75% labor, 25% materials. It depends what type of job it is. But often it's about 50-50. So a 50% deposit up front means that before you start the job and you start putting in all those materials that you can't take away again, you've secured that money that you need to pay for those materials as and when that wholesaler bill comes in. Or if you're paying cash for your materials directly, then you're going to need to be able to pay those up front before you start the job anyway. Now, for solar and things, you do need to be a bit careful because there are rules around MCS and how much deposit you can take. So I think the MCS rules are like, you can take 25% up front, and then you can take another 35% 2 weeks before the job or when the materials are delivered, and then the final 40% at the end. But ultimately, the rule is take a deposit to cover your materials. Now, I did a video about this a few years ago. I think it was about 4 years ago, actually, the last time I made a video about this. And a lot of people said in the comments, oh, I'd never pay a tradesperson up front for a job. But the reality is that if your business has got a good reputation, customers are just going to have to suck it up. Like, I would refuse to work for a customer if they refuse to pay a deposit, because in my mind, I'm like, well, there's alarm bells ringing here. If they're not even willing to, pay a deposit to secure the booking, are they ever going to pay? And it's actually a good way of filtering out non-payers right from the start. If they're not willing to pay a deposit, sorry, you're not our type of customer. Go and find somebody who is willing to work, and you pay everything afterwards. And I don't think there's that many tradespeople who don't take deposits now, but there are some for sure. Probably a lot of one-man bands get stuck with this. Now, if we follow the story along, so you've done the job, and then the materials are all in, you've completed the job, you send the invoice, and then they don't pay. Maybe it's a week, it drags on. 2 weeks, you're starting to sweat now. You're phoning the customer to check if everything's okay. Surprise, surprise, you can't get through to them. I don't know if you've ever experienced that, but I have, and it's super stressful. Then you send them emails, you phone again, you leave voicemails. It's been 4 weeks, they go radio silent. I even had one customer who got quite nasty and started threatening me. So in the end, I kind of just gave up and said, you know what, I'll take a loss on this one. But all of that pain and stress would have been solved if you'd at least have taken a deposit, because that you've covered your costs on the job at least. So, okay, if they don't pay the final bill, at least you can still pay the wholesaler and, maybe cover a little bit of your labor, and you're not going to go bust just because one customer didn't pay. So it's just such a game changer, taking deposits for jobs. And of course, if customers do have objections that sound genuine, you're just going to have to learn to reframe those objections and explain why you need to take a deposit, that, it secures the booking in your calendar, that they're not going to cancel. You can make sure that you order all the materials and that they're there on time, and all of those things. And if you're running a legit operation, like, we never have objections about deposits. Really, like, I can't remember the last time anyone objected about paying a deposit, so it shouldn't be a problem. But it does filter out time wasters early, so that's one side benefit of it. Now, when it comes to then paying those materials, some people will just go into Screwfix and pay over the counter for them straight away, or even a cash account at the wholesalers. But there are massive benefits to having credit accounts with your wholesalers, because that gives you some instant breathing room when it comes to paying for your materials. Most wholesalers will be quite happy to offer you a 30-day credit account. And what that means is that you go into the wholesaler, you order the materials, book them out for that job, you get the materials, you fit the materials, and then by the time the job is finished, you've maybe got a week or two still left before you actually have to pay for the materials. So in theory, you can get to the point where the customer's paid the final bill already before you have to pay for those materials. And again, it's just that breathing space that can help you with cash flow, because realistically, like, no business is linear. No business has a constant, steady income. It tends to be like a bit like this, you know, they say it's feast or famine in the electrical industry, and I've certainly experienced that. You'll have weeks where you're mad busy and the money's pouring in, and you have other weeks where it goes a bit quiet, and you know, you don't barely do any work, and you've got to be able to, like, you know, stabilize that roller coaster by just having enough breathing room to cover those weeks when things are a little bit quieter. So having something like a credit account with your wholesalers is a huge help with that, and it just avoids cash drain from having to pay for materials up front. Now, to set up these credit accounts, it's super easy. Just go into your wholesaler and ask for a credit account form, and as long as you've not like got a really terrible credit history with, you know, lots of history of going bankrupt before and stuff, they're usually pretty easy to give out these credit accounts. And depending on how much you would spend, they'll change the limit. So they might give you a 10 grand credit limit to start with, but if you start spending more, you can ask them to raise that credit limit up once you've got a bit of a reputation for regularly paying your monthly bill. In fact, some wholesalers like CEF, I believe, they give you an early settlement discount as well. So if you pay on time, it doesn't actually have to be early, but say like bang on the 30 days, they'll give you an extra 0.5% or 1% discount on the whole thing. So you actually end up getting the materials for cheaper by having a credit account as well. So that's one helpful thing to sort of ease the challenges with cash flow. Another thing that some people do, and this is something that we do for multiple reasons, is actually then paying your wholesaler bill with some form of credit card. I used to use an AMEX. Now I use Capital on Tap, because AMEX have gone really weird lately and like massively reduced our credit limit and stuff. Capital on Tap have been amazing so far. We've been using them for about 6 months now, and they've given us a really good credit limit. But the advantage of both of these is then it gives you an extra 30 days. So you end up kind of having 2 months buffer before you have to pay your materials. But also you get points and things, which can actually build up a lot. If you're spending, like we're spending hundreds of thousands every year on materials, if you're putting all of that through your card that gives you points, you can build up a serious amount of points, which then you can use for buying stuff for the business, for staff perks, things like that. I think at the end of last year, we gave every employee a several £100 voucher just from the points, you know, and it didn't cost us anything. It was just points that have built up because we'd been smart with how we'd spent our money, and that was a benefit to everyone in the team. But I've also bought laptops with Amazon vouchers off the back of it and things like that, you know, business assets, computer equipment and all of that stuff, just from the points that I've built up from spending through a card like an Amex or a Capital on Tap. So that's another nice tip. Now, you do need to be careful, because with any credit cards, you don't want to be paying them off any later than the 30 days. Otherwise, you start to pay interest. So you've got to really use it in a clever way, not in a stupid way. But as long as you've got the money there to pay it off, it's just extra money and extra breathing space essentially in your pocket. So it's, you know, quite a useful tool to be able to do that. Just use them responsibly, I would say. Now, that's kind of materials, which is a big chunk of your cash flow in and out. But there's something else that really catches people off guard a lot, and that is tax. So for most businesses, if you're turning over more than 80 grand or 85 grand or whatever, you're going to be registered for VAT. That's something that you pay quarterly. So every 3 months, all of that money that's flowed into your business, you know, 20% of that minus the 20% of your expenses is going to go to the VAT man, and you're responsible to pay that regularly. It's not your money. So a lot of people see the total figure that comes in, you know, if it's £1,000 job plus VAT, 1,200 quid comes in, right? And it's so easy to think that that 200 quid is also yours, but it's not. You're just looking after it for the VAT man ultimately. So it's really easy to get stuck and forget that you're going to have a big VAT bill to pay at the end of each quarter. And then there's also your end of year tax bill, whether it be corporation tax if you're a limited company, or whether it be your personal tax bill if you're sole trader or a partnership. So how do you make sure that you don't get stuck at the end of the VAT quarter or at the end of the year trying to find that money? A simple rule that I've followed for a long time now, and it's just a way to tax proof your business basically, is the 30% rule. So everything that comes into your bank account, set aside 30% straight away into a savings account. That will more than cover your VAT and your corporation tax at the end of the quarter or at the end of the year. And what we find is that actually it builds up quite nicely into a bit of a savings pot where you pay your VAT bill and you've still got a decent amount left to be able to, you know, reinvest into the business or just to have as a bit of a war chest. So it's a good way to kind of build up a bit of savings. Now you can do this, like some bank accounts allow you to do this automatically. So one of my businesses, we've got a Monzo business account, and it's really great. It's very clever. You can just set it up so that you have pots. So I've got a pot that sets aside 20% of everything that comes in. That's the VAT pot. I've got another pot that sets aside 10% of everything that comes in. That's the corporation tax pot. And it means that I kind of don't see that money. It's just something comes in, the money falls through into the pots. What's left in the main account is what we can use. And the other stuff is just, I try and forget about it basically. Don't even count it as the balance. But when I pay the VAT bill, usually there's actually a decent chunk left, which you can then view as like a bonus, a bit of profit, or some savings that you can use to do other things. So that's a nice way of doing it. Other bank accounts are not so clever. So you might just go through and every week count up how much has come into the account, take 30% of that and stick it into a savings account. But again, actually, there's a nice benefit to that, which is that you can get some fairly high interest savings accounts now. And that money, rather than it just sitting in your current account earning nothing, you can actually be earning interest on that money that you've set aside ready for the VAT bill or the corporation tax bill. You can be earning, you know, 3 to 4% now with that money just sitting in a savings account. So it's generating you some form of income rather than it just sitting there doing nothing. So that's a really top tip, I would say, to just make sure that you always have the VAT money ready to pay the VAT bill and your tax money ready to pay your tax at the end of the year. Now, if you've done all of this stuff and you're still finding that there's not enough money at the end of each month or each quarter or whatever, reality is you're probably just not charging enough, and that's what's killing your cash flow. So again, it goes back to calculating your overhead and making sure that you're pricing for profit. Because if you're not doing that, if you're spending more than you're earning, you're always going to have a problem with cash flow. So definitely recommend watching that pricing webinar. And I've done a full pricing masterclass now on School that you can get access to if you didn't see that webinar already. Now, there's some kind of advanced strategies that we might say when you start to get a bit bigger, because when you get to a bit of a bigger business level, then you need to take cash flow even more seriously. You know, the stuff that we've talked about so far is really just basic for small businesses. But when you start to get a bit bigger, and it's a good practice to do even if you're a small business, you need to do what's called a cash flow forecast. And that's really the sort of guaranteed way to actually make sure that what's coming in and what's going out at certain times doesn't result in a negative balance in your bank account. So the idea is you have a spreadsheet and you go through and you go, right, what's coming in and when is it coming in? And then you line that up with what's going out and when is it going out, and you have a balance that's sort of in the middle that basically shows what is the bank balance going to be at these different times as these various things come in and go out. So how to predict what's coming in? Well, you've just got to look at your calendar basically and see what jobs you've got coming up. And then you can pop those in and those amounts. Then you should be able to pop in roughly like, when are your wholesaler bills going to be going out? When are your materials going out? When are your other bills going out? And what does that look like? And you should be able to get a kind of an overview of the cash flow that will be happening in the next month, the next 2 months, 3 months, whatever it might be. Ideally, you know, for a small business, you at least want to be doing a month's worth of cash flow forecasts, and it should be probably on a weekly basis. For a larger business, you might be doing it on a quarterly basis, something like that. But the idea is to actually be able to forecast and predict what that cash flow looks like by looking at your earnings and your expenses and the timings of those, to make sure that they don't go too out of kilter and you get a problem. And it's really interesting because when you do it, you can often find that, oh my goodness, like if we don't earn a certain amount at this point, then we're going to be in trouble. So then you can push extra hard to get a few more jobs over the line just to fill the calendar up and make sure that you don't get into trouble. Or you can proactively in advance, like preemptively, change some of your expenses or do things to make sure that you don't get into trouble when it comes to paying your bills later on. That's something that we do now. It's been a while that we've been doing it, but it has been a challenge to properly get it into place. But it's helped massively because now we have a much stronger hold on all of our numbers and we know where we're going in the future. And it also means you can predict spending as well, because if you know that you're going to have an excess of cash, then you can go, okay, we've got some money that's going to be starting to build up here. We can plan what we can do with that money. How can we reinvest it into the business to grow the business, or whatever you might want to do. Now, there's a brilliant book that I would recommend to you guys by a guy called Michalowicz, something like that. I'll put a link to it when I post this lesson on school. It's called Profit First, and it's just great. It takes some of the ideas that I've talked about, like, you know, putting aside various different pots in advance, and basically the idea behind it is you take your profit first, right? Profit is the key. You should always make sure that your profit is set aside first, and your tax and all of that other stuff. And he recommends, very much like me, having these pots where you allocate funds into different things, because otherwise if you just have one pot, it's just so easy for the money to just sort of disappear, you know. But if you set it aside first, then it's safe. That's the idea behind it, really. Now, what about if you're having problems with slow payers? Because that's probably one of the biggest things that impacts businesses when it comes to cash flow, is waiting for customers to pay. There's a couple of things that you can do here. One is check your payment terms and maybe tighten those up. So for us, we just have like a 24-hour payment term, essentially. So the day after the invoice is sent, the customer owes us the money. Now, realistically, they might take 2 or 3 days to pay, but if you give them a 7, like the psychology of this is quite interesting, because if you give them a 7-day payment terms, often they'll be like, oh, I'm not going to pay it straight away because I've got 7 days. And then they forget, right? It's not fresh in their mind. So then 7 days comes and they're like, oh, I need to pay that bill. And then they put it off, and then it's 10 days and it can drag on. Whereas if payment is due on completion, psychologically it's perfect for the human brain, because they just go, right, the job's done, brilliant, paid, sorted, move on, and they'll pay it straight away. Whereas if you give them that week, then like psychologically that we're going, oh well, I've got a week to pay, so why would I pay now? You know, because it's better to have that money in my own account than in somebody else's. And you shoot yourself in the foot by giving people 7-day terms. Now, obviously, I'm talking about residential here, you know, business to customer, B2C. If we're doing B2B, it's different. Like the expected terms really are usually 30 days B2B. So you're going to have to just build that into your business model. If you're doing a lot of B2B work, working for other businesses, you're going to have to get used to the fact that you're going to have to wait 30 days to get paid. And often that's just because they have processes in place where they have a weekly pay run or a monthly pay run that they do, and they've got to have payments approved and things like that. A lot of businesses are not just going to be able to pay you at the click of a finger unless they're a small business that the director does all the payments themselves and stuff. So that's a little bit different. But again, like I would never allow more than 30-day payment terms if I was working for another business. Some businesses say, oh, we pay after 60 days or 90 days. And I'm just like, no way, sorry, like that is not happening. Like for any business's cash flow to have to wait 60 to 90 days to get paid, that is a recipe for disaster. So I would try to avoid working for any companies who want to impose that kind of level of payment terms. And another thing that you can do when it comes to payments and speeding things up is just use a system that sends out automatic payment reminders. Make it as easy as possible for your customers to pay. So if you've got a system where you can take a card payment, some softwares like Tradify, for example, it gives them a button on the invoice they can click and pay by card straight away. There is a disadvantage to that, which is you're going to have to pay some card fees, but if it helps you with your cash flow and to get the money quicker, sometimes it's worth it. So yeah, automatic reminders and taking card payments is one thing that can speed up your payments coming in. Now, there's another thing that can happen with cash flow, and that's when it comes to what we call seasonality. So some businesses are seasonal, where you'll get more work. Your peak of work is at a certain time of the year, and you have a lull at another time of the year. I think maybe all electricians experience this a little bit. In the past, for us, it's always been the sort of holiday period has always been a bit weird. It's either been really, really busy or really, really quiet. But now, because we're mostly doing solar, I'd say that period is more often the quietest period. So we call it our like quarter of death because you've got the holidays, so employees are off, you're not going to get as much work done even if you've got the possible work there. But then you've got the factor of it's just like the solar stuff is kind of dead at that time of year. You don't really want to be up on roofs in the freezing cold, pouring rain and stuff at that time of year. Customers are not so much thinking about getting solar at that time of year. And also customers are on holiday. Most businesses are closed for a few weeks around the holidays. So for us now, we're always prepared for that quarter to be like just a bit of a dead quarter. Like we will, if we break even or make a small profit in that quarter, perfect. But what we need to be sure of is that we've got enough cash to pay everything during that quarter, knowing that there'll be less coming in. So that's something to really bear in mind. If your business has any kind of seasonality and you have quiet months, you need to prepare for those quiet months by having some kind of cash reserves to ride out those sort of valleys in your business model when it comes to the cash flow. So those are some of my kind of top tips around cash flow. Hopefully those have been interesting and beneficial to you guys. But over to you now. Have you got any questions? I'd love to hear your thoughts.